Welcome back to Bible in Context. In our last episode, we explored the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary where God dwelled among his people during their journey in the wilderness. Today we're moving forward to its permanent counterpart, the temple in Jerusalem. The temple wasn't just a building for the people of Israel, it was the very heart of their national and spiritual identity. It was the place where heaven and earth met, where God's presence was said to dwell, and where his people came to worship. Let's set the stage. After the Israelites settled in the Promised Land, the tabernacle remained the center of worship for centuries, but under King Solomon, David's son, the first permanent temple was built in Jerusalem around the 10th century BC. This temple was magnificent, lined with cedar overlaid with gold and filled with symbolic features, carried over from the tabernacle: the altar, the lampstands, the bread of the presence, and most importantly, the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. When it was dedicated, God's glory filled the temple, a visible sign that he was dwelling among his people. But the temple was more than architecture. It was the center of sacrifice and worship. Israelites would travel to Jerusalem for festivals like Passover, bringing offerings and sacrifices as acts of devotion and atonement. The temple symbolized God's holiness and the need for his people to approach him through sacrifice. Yet, the temple also became a barometer of Israel's faithfulness. When the people turned away from God, the temple became corrupted. Prophets like Jeremiah warned that outward rituals without true devotion meant nothing, and sadly in 586 BC, when Babylon conquered Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed. For the people, this was devastating. Without the temple, how could they worship? Had God abandoned them? But even in exile, God reminded them through prophets like Ezekiel that his presence was not limited to a building. After the exile, when the Jewish people returned under leaders like Zerubbabel, they rebuilt the temple. Though it wasn't as glorious as Solomon's, it became the center of worship again. Later, King Herod expanded and renovated it, creating the massive structure that stood during the time of Jesus. This is the temple we read about in the Gospels, the place where Jesus was dedicated as a baby, where he taught, and where he overturned the tables of the money changers. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn. Jesus made a shocking claim in John 2:19. "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." He wasn't talking about the stone building, he was talking about his body. Jesus was saying that he himself is the true temple, the meeting place between God and humanity. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus made a way for us to come into God's presence without the need for animal sacrifices or a physical temple. That changes everything. For the early church, especially after the temple was destroyed by Rome in AD 70, this truth became central. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6:19 that believers are now temples of the Holy Spirit. God's presence doesn't dwell in a building made by human hands, it dwells in his people. So what can we take from this today? First, the temple reminds us of God's holiness. Approaching him is not something to take lightly. Second, it reminds us of the seriousness of sin and the need for atonement. And third, it points us to Jesus, the true temple, who brings us into God's presence. We no longer need to travel to Jerusalem to encounter God through Christ. He dwells with us wherever we are. The temple was the center of worship and identity for ancient Israel, but it also foreshadowed something greater. And that greater reality is here, God with us, through Jesus. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Bible in Context. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore the Roman Empire, the world of Jesus and the apostles.